Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us in our audio blog series on learner experience. On today's blog, we're going to talk a little bit about what goes into a good modern learning experience and how it differs from traditional L&D. I am David Wentworth, the Principal Learning Analyst here at Brandon Hall Group, and I am joined by Carl Chrysostomo, who is the Product Manager for Content at Saba Software. So, Carl, we've talked a little bit in other instances of these audio blogs about why it's important to have a learning experience, modern learning experience, and we've also talked about effectively implementing it and measuring a modern learning experience. But what goes into a good learning experience, and how does that differ from what we've seen in the past?
Yeah, I think from a learner's perspective, there are kind of three things really that stand out in terms of what makes a good learning experience. And I think the first one is that experience is relevant and it's interesting. It's aligned from a relevancy point of view. It's aligned to personal goals. I can see how it connects to business goals. I think it also needs to be visually engaging. We often talk now about beautiful learning experiences. And I think modern learning technology can really help you raise your game in this area. It can start engaging the learner in a conversation about what's important to them. It can pull on external and internal data about them, and it can track their behaviors. And all of these things really help bring some relevance to the experience. I think the second thing is that it should be delivered in a style that the learner likes and in their language. So you need to get to understand what the learner likes and give it to them in that style. You need to understand the language or even the languages that learner speaks and give the learning experience to them in that language. And at this point, I can hear people saying, this is really difficult. I've got an example. I've got 3,000 employees in 8 locations around the world. This is a really tough thing to do. And I think, look, to deliver a truly personalized learning experience at scale, this is what's required. And again, modern learning technologies can really help out. Through the use of AI, it can get to know these preferences, and it can kind of help direct the learner as well. And I think one area that kind of really excites me, and I think it's a bit of a game changer, is when we move into the realms of hyper personalization in learning. As a term I stole from our marketing colleagues here at Saba, and platforms such as Volley, so find them at volley.com, as in the tennis volley. They're bringing AI into content creation, and they're creating tailored experiences by curating content from both inside and outside of the organization that is aligned to need. So it's really in the style that particular individual wants. And thirdly, I think it should be easy to access wherever the learner is and whenever they need it. And when I first started working in e-learning in the late 90s, I had a poster behind my desk. It was from SmartForce. It said learning anytime, anywhere. And that's a big marketing message at the time. And I think this idea has been now resurfaced and kind of driven firstly by mobile and more around the recent idea of learning in the flow of work, this kind of concept that is centered around surfacing learning in systems that I spend most of my time in.
So, you mentioned that the idea around learning anytime, anywhere. And then also we talked, you mentioned a bit about some of the technologies. So what has happened is that the LMS has not been able to deliver on that promise of learning anytime, anywhere that has been around for years now. Is that why we're having this renewed conversation?
Yeah, I think kind of LMSs haven't really have been slow in adopting kind of improved learning experiences, and this has kind of led to the rise of the learning experience platforms, and they're kind of changing how we think about delivering learning or experiences to our learners. But what's quite funny here is that something interesting is happening in this space, because I think some LXP providers are slowly becoming LMSs, and now LMSs kind of making a charge for the LXP space. So it'd be interesting to see what happens in this kind of mashup of technology. It's certainly quite confusing for the buyer.
True, and I think that's just born out of the fact that a complete learning experience is going to have requirements around it that's the LMS is uniquely poised to deliver on. Especially we talk about things like compliance and certifications and that sort of tracking, whereas the LXPs do a lot of the other stuff. And so yeah, we do start to see the blending where more core functional LMSs start to adopt some of that LXP functionality, whereas pure LXP players are starting to adopt some of that core LMS functionality, so they can try to meet as many needs as they possibly can. But I think we're currently in a place where they have to, and they seem to play pretty well together to make sure that all their needs are met in a sort of seamless environment for the learner.
Exactly. The learner is most important in that particular conversation.
Yeah. So, what are some of the elements required to say that you've got, a good learning experience? I mean, so we talked a little bit about, the relevancy and the ties to outcomes. Let's talk a little bit more about things like, the personalization and contextualization. And you mentioned a bit about AI as far as, content creation. What about just within the experience itself?
Yeah, I think when it comes to personalization, I think this is when I look at we've got names like LXP, LEP, modern integrated corporate learning platforms, all of these things. I think what we're kind of seeing is that they're all approaching it from lots of different directions. But I think when you cut through all of those layers, you're looking at a few things, and personalization is one of them. How do you put the learner at the center of the experience, and how do you get it working for their needs? And I mentioned it kind of extends out to that idea of learning in the flow of work and how we can bring learning to the day-to-day as well. And I think another one is allowing them to connect this kind of idea of connectivity, how the learner can, there's so many great resources inside and outside of the organization as well. And it's about an experience that takes advantage of that and allows the learner to connect to those different experiences. And they could be, libraries of content, things that are created in-house, even stuff that sits on places like SharePoint and things that are out in the web. How do we bring all of those things together in one place?
Yeah, I think one of the key elements in this experience is we're seeing a big improvement on companies being able to connect learners with one another. It started to bubble up a few years ago in the big talk around social learning and collaborative learning, and it's a real key element of this new experience that companies are finally waking up and realizing that they've hired a bunch of smart people in their organization. I think if you went to their recruitment folks and their onboarding, they'd say, listen, we find the best candidates, we hire the best people, but then for some reason, once they're hired, learning doesn't want them talking to each other or sharing any information. And we've finally started to break that a bit and realize that, look, this is where people go for information anyway. They turn to their peers, they turn to people they trust. Let's give them the tools and the platforms to do that in a much easier way that's scalable and repeatable and reusable, so that those sort of interactions don't just come and go, but then they become part of the entire sort of source of truth for learning. So that's a little bit about what goes into a good modern learning experience. I hope you join us for some of the other audio blogs in this series on learner experience, and we'll talk a little bit more about implementing that experience as well as measuring it. And I want to thank Carl for joining me and all of you for listening in, and we hope you enjoyed this audio blog. Thank you.